18 days before the night everything came apart, Hawthorne Vector Systems thought it had already escaped the disaster of its lifetime. And the city of Chicago believed the same thing when the headlines called the recovery a miracle of modern engineering. When investors toasted a chief executive named Genevieve Hawthorne for steering an $11 billion catastrophe into a quiet footnote, and when a stage was built inside a ballroom to honor every executive who had supposedly fought to save the company. What none of those headlines mentioned, what none of those toasts acknowledged, was a quiet, exhausted engineer named Evan Rourke. A single father who had spent 17 sleepless nights solving the very crisis those executives were now celebrating. A man whose name had been carefully erased from every document before a single glass of champagne was poured, and whose absence from the guest list would soon become the only thing standing between that company and the destruction it had only pretended to outrun. If a story like this moved you, follow along to see what happens when the man they erased decides he will not stay invisible. 18 days before the gala, Evan was alone in a quiet section of the monitoring floor, reviewing thermal readings pulled from an energy storage unit installed at St. Aurelia Hospital, and what he saw on the screen did not match what the rest of the building believed to be true. Because while the automated safety software reported the unit as fully stable, the temperature curves across its 3 internal cooling loops were drifting apart in a pattern that should never have existed in a properly balanced system. A pattern that repeated itself every several hours, like a slow, mechanical heartbeat slipping out of rhythm. He pulled the data again, then again, checking his own instruments before trusting his own eyes, because a finding like this was not the kind of thing a careful engineer announced without absolute certainty. And what worried him most was not the single hospital unit in front of him, but the realization that the same flawed pattern, if it existed in one unit built on this platform, almost certainly existed in every other unit built the same way. Units that had already been sold and installed across hospitals, schools, data centers, and government facilities throughout the country, units numbering in the tens of thousands. When Evan brought the discrepancy to his department head, he was told that a temperature variance of less than 1% across 3 loops fell well within acceptable engineering tolerance, that customers were not engineers and would never notice a half-degree drift, and that escalating this kind of finding before quarterly numbers were finalized would only create panic where none was warranted, and so Evan was sent back to his desk with a polite dismissal disguised as professional confidence. He did not let it go, because the math told a different story than the reassurances did, and over the following 2 days he pulled diagnostic logs from 40 other installed sites at random, finding the same cyclical drift in nearly every one of them. A finding that meant Hawthorne Vector was not looking at a single defective hospital unit, but at a structural flaw buried inside the design used across an entire generation of storage systems, a flaw that, left unaddressed, could eventually cause control modules to misread their own internal temperatures and shut down or, worse, fail to shut down at all. The math behind a full recall was almost too large to say out loud in a single sentence, because replacing or repairing every affected unit could cost the company more than $11 billion, could trigger the cancellation of a pending federal energy contract worth billions more, could collapse investor confidence overnight, and could put thousands of ordinary employees out of work long before any executive ever felt the consequences personally. And it was with that math sitting heavy in his chest that Evan requested an emergency meeting with leadership, only to be granted 5 minutes by Chief Operating Officer Preston Rothwell, a man who listened with visible impatience, and then told him, almost gently, that an engineer should not be allowed to throw an entire corporation into panic over a few blinking numbers on a screen. Rather than argue, Evan asked for one more chance, wheeled in a small thermal model he had built using a spare control unit, and predicted aloud, to the exact minute, when an experimental module running the same software would shut itself down without warning, and 3 seconds after his predicted time arrived, the lights across the entire testing lab went dark, leaving Preston standing in stunned silence in front of the very disaster he had just called impossible. The silence in that lab lasted longer than anyone expected, because watching a man predict a failure to the second was not the same as hearing him describe one in theory, and even the technicians who had spent years working under Preston's direction found themselves glancing at Evan with a quiet, reluctant respect that none of them dared say aloud, knowing that respect spoken too loudly in front of a superior could easily be mistaken for disloyalty, and so the room simply stood there in the dark, waiting for someone with enough authority to admit what had just happened actually mattered. In the days that followed the blackout, denial was no longer an option, and Genevieve Hawthorne convened an emergency session with her senior leadership team, demanding absolute secrecy outside that room because any leak to the press or to regulators before a fix existed could trigger the very collapse they were trying to prevent. And she gave her engineering division 20 days, not a single day more, to produce a working solution before federal disclosure requirements forced her hand regardless of what they found. More than 60 engineers were split into competing teams overnight, most of them pushing toward the obvious, expensive answer of replacing every control module across the entire installed base, a plan that would still cost billions of dollars and take more than a year to complete even under the most optimistic schedule. A plan that solved the financial reporting problem on paper, while leaving customers exposed to risk for months on end. Evan believed the real flaw was never in the hardware itself, but in the way the 3 cooling loops communicated with one another under stress, miscommunicating just enough to create the illusion of safety when none existed. And from that belief he proposed something the senior engineers initially dismissed as too modest for a problem this large. A system he called the adaptive tri-loop balance, built around a predictive algorithm that anticipated thermal divergence before it happened, a set of mechanical flow valves that could redirect cooling on their own, an independent backup controller untouched by the original flawed logic, and a containment mechanism that could isolate a single failing cluster instead of shutting an entire unit down. Preston considered the proposal too simple to be trusted with a multi-billion-dollar product line and assigned Evan to a small, forgotten testing room with only 2 technicians to assist him, a decision that read less like caution and more like quiet punishment for a man who had embarrassed the company by being right when everyone else had insisted he was wrong. For 17 consecutive nights, Evan barely left that room, sleeping in short stretches at his own workbench, running test after test as the technicians rotated shifts around him, while his daughter Marin, now 20, and studying industrial design, brought him food on one of those nights and noticed something that struck her harder than the exhaustion on her father's face, which was that the whiteboard behind him was filled entirely with executive names, even though every diagram on it, every equation, every sketch of the cooling architecture had clearly come from his own hand. Evan never asked her to be angry about it, telling her simply that recognition was not what kept him awake those 17 nights, that what kept him awake was the thought of thousands of employees who would lose their jobs and thousands of customers whose buildings depended on systems quietly ticking toward failure. And when the final 48-hour endurance test finished without a single thermal spike, Preston looked at the results in silence, said almost nothing, and quietly instructed his assistant to copy every file from the testing server onto a private drive that belonged to him alone. What none of the technicians in that room understood at the time was how deliberate that silence had been, because a man less interested in claiming someone else's work might have simply celebrated the result, might have walked straight to Genevieve's office to share the good news honestly. But Preston had already begun building a different version of events long before the final test even finished, rehearsing language in his own mind about leadership and vision and decisive strategy, language that conveniently required no mention of a tired engineer who had barely slept in over 2 weeks. Word of the successful test spread through Hawthorne Vector within a single day, and the adaptive tri-loop balance was rushed into trial deployment across 50 separate sites, every one of them returning the same stable, repeatable results that Evan's model had promised from the very beginning. Results that confirmed the company could avoid the $11 billion recall entirely by deploying a fix that cost only a small fraction of that amount. Genevieve was thrilled by the numbers, but never personally met with the engineer who had produced them, because Preston had already told her a different story, one in which a group he called the Rothwell Task Force, composed of senior directors and outside consultants, had collaboratively engineered the breakthrough, a story in which Evan's name appeared nowhere except in a buried appendix where he was listed simply as supporting technician, a title that erased 17 sleepless nights into a single forgettable line. Preston went further still, quietly renaming the adaptive tri-loop balance as the Rothwell Vector Shield, stripping away even the name Evan had given his own creation, and when Evan objected, demanding the documentation be corrected before future maintenance teams found themselves working blind on a system whose true architecture had been hidden from them. Preston offered only mockery in response, telling him that ideas did not save companies, that people who knew how to turn an idea into a story investors believed were the ones who actually saved companies. When Evan pushed harder, warning that erasing the original engineer's identity from technical records was not merely unfair but dangerous for anyone who might need to service these systems years later, Preston threatened him instead, suggesting that continued resistance could be framed as a security violation, one that would conveniently strip away any bonus owed to him for the very crisis he had just resolved. Genevieve announced the company's survival to financial media within days, describing it publicly as a triumph of decisive leadership and unified executive vision, language her communications team had drafted weeks in advance for exactly this moment. And the stock price surged as analysts praised the kind of forward-thinking management that could apparently solve an $11 billion engineering catastrophe through sheer strategic willpower alone. A celebration was planned almost immediately, an extravagant evening titled The Night Hawthorne Survived, to be held inside the grand ballroom of the Carrington Grand Hotel, with invitations extended to every senior director, every outside consultant, every major investor, and several federal officials whose pending contract depended on confidence in the very system Evan had built. And when the final guest list was assembled, his name was nowhere on it. When Evan contacted Human Resources to ask whether an oversight had occurred, he was told plainly that the evening was reserved for executive leadership and that members of the technical staff were welcome to watch the celebration through an internal live stream from their desks instead, an answer delivered with the kind of bureaucratic calm that made clear no one on the other end of that conversation saw anything wrong with what they had just said. That evening, opening the gala announcement email out of simple curiosity, Evan found a promotional image of Preston standing confidently beside a blown-up rendering of Evan's own original schematic, beneath a headline declaring him the architect of an $11 billion miracle, and for a long moment Evan simply stared at the screen, not in disbelief, but in the quiet, settled understanding of exactly how little his 17 nights had meant to the people now claiming them as their own. The night of the gala arrived inside a hall built for spectacle. Hundreds of investors, officials, and senior staff gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, a full-scale physical model of the storage system Evan had designed displayed proudly at the center of the stage, its true creator's name nowhere to be found on any plaque, any banner, or any printed program handed to guests at the door. Preston was introduced as the man who had personally commanded the rescue effort, and Genevieve took the microphone soon after to credit the company's survival to what she called decisive leadership and the unbreakable unity of her management team. language that drew warm applause from a room full of people who had never once set foot inside the small testing room, where the real work had actually happened. Miles away in a quiet section of the building, Evan remained at his post monitoring the first wave of newly upgraded systems coming online across the country, and it was there that he discovered a software change Preston had personally approved, one that had stripped Evan's authorship identifiers out of the underlying design files entirely. A change that did far more than steal credit, because it also quietly buried the true engineering origin of a system the federal government was about to depend on. Marin called her father during the broadcast, confused as to why he was not on the screen surrounded by the people thanking him for saving the company, and Evan answered her only with the truth as plainly as he understood it himself, telling her that some rooms do not forget a person by accident, that some rooms decide, deliberately, that a particular person is simply not worth remembering. Marin sat with that answer in silence for a long moment before asking whether he regretted any of it, whether 17 sleepless nights spent saving a company that could not even spell his name correctly on an internal memo had been worth the cost to his own health and peace of mind, and Evan told her honestly that regret was a complicated word for what he felt, that he did not regret the work itself, only the quiet, accumulating realization that decency inside a place like Hawthorne Vector had apparently always been optional, rather than expected. On stage, Preston accepted an award for Innovative Leader of the Year, describing the breakthrough as something that had emerged from a strategy session he had personally led, a story that fell apart the moment Chairman Reginald Carrington, listening closely from his seat near the front, asked Preston a simple technical question about how the 3 cooling loops actually interacted, a question Preston could not answer with anything beyond vague, confident phrases that meant nothing to anyone who understood the system at all. At almost the same moment, as a federal contract worth $4,800,000,000 sat ready for signature near the side of the stage, a government representative named Dr. Lenora Sloan requested to review the intellectual property documentation behind the system before any signature was finalized. A routine request that should have taken minutes, and it was Chief Legal Counsel Serena Whitlock who opened those files first, only to find that the name of the original inventor had been quietly removed from several earlier document versions entirely. Lenora looked out across a stage full of confident, decorated executives and asked a single, simple question that none of them expected, asking plainly who the first engineer had been to actually design this 3-loop system, and as the silence stretched on, no one standing beneath those bright stage lights could give her an honest answer. Serena returned to the legal archive that same night and found something Preston had clearly hoped would never surface, a filed provisional patent application under Evan Rourke's name, dated nearly 3 years before he had ever been hired by Hawthorne Vector at all, a document confirming that the foundational concept behind the entire cooling architecture had existed long before any task force, any committee, or any executive strategy session. Preston liked to describe in interviews. According to the original employment agreement Evan had signed when he joined the company, any invention created before his start date remained legally his own property, with Hawthorne retaining only the right to test such inventions internally, meaning that any attempt to commercialize the technology, especially through a federal contract requiring full disclosure of intellectual property ownership, would require a separate, formal transfer agreement that had never actually been signed. During the height of the crisis, Evan had signed only a narrow emergency authorization, allowing temporary internal use of his design to prevent immediate harm, a document that never granted Hawthorne any commercial ownership whatsoever, and Preston, fully aware of this distinction, had deliberately represented the technology to the government as wholly owned company property in order to keep the federal contract moving forward on schedule. The moment this became clear, Lenora halted the signing ceremony entirely, stating without hesitation that the federal government could not finalize a purchase of a system whose ownership remained legally unresolved. And word of the halted signing began spreading quietly through the crowd within minutes, threatening to send the company's stock price into a steep decline the instant markets opened the following morning. Genevieve turned immediately to Preston, demanding an explanation, and he dismissed the entire situation as a minor administrative oversight, insisting that Evan would surely sign whatever was needed if simply offered enough additional money, a level of confidence that revealed exactly how little Preston understood the man he had spent weeks erasing from every record he could touch. Reginald asked, quite simply, which table Evan Rourke was seated at, and the silence that followed, his question filled the room far more completely than any applause had. Earlier that evening, broken only when an event coordinator finally admitted that Mr. Rourke's name did not appear anywhere on the official guest list at all. It was an extraordinary reversal taking shape in real time, because the man the entire company had spent the evening praising as a hero could not legally complete the very contract that Hero's work had made possible, while the man dismissed as too insignificant to invite now held, without anyone in that room fully realizing it yet, the only signature capable of determining whether Hawthorne Vector's future survived the night intact. Genevieve ordered her assistant to call Evan immediately, and as his phone began ringing somewhere across the city, Preston remained frozen on stage, still holding the trophy that bore credit for work his own hands had never touched. When Genevieve finally reached him by phone, she made no mention of the gala he had not been invited to, choosing instead to describe what she called a small paperwork issue and asking him to come to the hotel immediately to sign a transfer agreement before the night ended, a request delivered with the calm urgency of someone hoping the size of the favor would distract from everything that had led to needing it. Evan asked her directly whether his name would finally appear in the official record, and Genevieve avoided the question entirely, replying only that personal recognition was not the priority at a moment like this, an answer that told Evan everything he needed to know about how the company still viewed the difference between his labor and his name. Preston took the phone from her and offered Evan what he clearly believed was a generous resolution, a one-time bonus of $50,000, a technical advisory title with no real authority attached to it, a strict confidentiality agreement, and permission to simply return to work the following morning, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, an offer that asked Evan to sign a statement confirming the technology had been developed entirely during his employment at Hawthorne, a claim both men in that conversation knew to be false. Evan understood immediately that none of them were offering an apology, that what they actually wanted was a signature capable of turning a lie into something legally permanent, and he refused outright to put his name on a document built around a falsehood, a refusal Preston answered by accusing him of exploiting a corporate crisis for personal gain, warning that thousands of employees could lose their jobs because of one engineer's selfishness. Evan answered calmly that it was Preston himself who had created this exact crisis the moment he chose to erase the name of the person who actually owned the technology everyone now depended on. And later that night, when Marin expressed fear that standing against a company this powerful could cost her father everything he had worked for, Evan admitted quietly that he shared that fear, but told her he could not bear the alternative of letting her watch him sell away his own name to the very people who had stolen it from him first. Rather than demanding millions of dollars for himself, Evan laid out 3 specific conditions before agreeing to discuss anything further, insisting first that every original technical record be fully restored to its accurate authorship, second, that an independent investigation be opened into who had altered those records and why, and third, that the names of everyone who had genuinely contributed to the solution be made public rather than buried in an unread appendix. Behind the scenes, away from that conversation entirely, Preston quietly instructed corporate security to deactivate Evan's employee credentials and begin assembling a formal case accusing him of attempting to steal company property, a decision made not out of confidence in its truth, but out of desperation to silence a man whose honesty had just become the single greatest threat to everything Preston had built his reputation on. Preston told himself, in the privacy of his own office, that this was simply how survival worked at a certain level of corporate life, that the people who rose highest were never the ones who did the most careful work, but the ones who controlled the most convincing story. And he repeated that justification to himself often enough that he had nearly come to believe it, even as the evidence quietly accumulating against him made that belief harder to sustain with every passing hour. By the following morning, Preston had constructed an entirely new narrative for the board, claiming that Evan had secretly withheld ownership of his patent for years, deliberately waiting for the company to fall into crisis before extorting it for personal profit, a story designed to recast the very engineer who had saved the company as the architect of its near destruction instead. Corporate security soon produced what appeared to be damning evidence, a file discovered on Evan's work computer outlining a proposal to sell the cooling technology to a direct competitor, a file Evan insisted he had never created and had never even seen before that moment, an insistence that might easily have been dismissed as the predictable denial of a man caught in the act, had Serena not decided to look closer at exactly when and how that file had appeared. What Serena found was that the file had been uploaded only after remote access privileges tied directly to Preston's own administrative credentials had been activated, a discovery that shifted her suspicion from simple corporate misconduct towards something far closer to deliberate evidence tampering, and from that point forward, she began quietly building a far more complete picture of everything Preston had touched since the crisis began. At almost the same time, the very demonstration model displayed on stage the night before began issuing fresh thermal warnings, the result of an emergency software update Preston had personally requested in order to strip out the last remaining traces of Evan's original code, an update that had unintentionally thrown the three cooling loops out of sync with one another, recreating the exact danger the entire celebration had claimed to have already solved. None of the executives standing near that model understood enough about its actual architecture to fix what was now failing in front of investors and government officials alike, because all of them had spent their energy learning how to present the solution, rather than learning how the solution actually worked. And if the unit was forced into emergency shutdown in front of the cameras and officials still present, the company's entire public claim of victory would collapse within minutes. Genevieve had no choice but to ask Evan to return to the hotel, not only to sign documents, but to physically repair a system unraveling in real time, and Evan agreed to come back, though this time he brought with him his original handwritten engineering notebooks, his filed patent documents, a complete version history of every line of code he had written, the written warning he had sent Preston weeks earlier, and a prototype controller stamped with his own private serial number, proof that no story built without him could survive contact with the truth. When Evan arrived at the Carrington Grand a second time, the same security staff who had been told nothing about his earlier involvement looked at his work clothes and stopped him at the door without hesitation. And despite everything unfolding inside that building because of his work, his name still did not appear anywhere on the list controlling who was allowed to walk through it. Evan explained calmly that the chief executive herself had asked him to return, but the event manager held firm, unwilling to override written instructions without proper authorization, and just past the door behind them, displayed prominently on a massive screen, was the very system Evan had designed, now paired publicly with Preston Rothwell's name rather than his own. A security guard suggested Evan use the maintenance entrance instead, a suggestion offered without malice, but with a kind of careless ease that revealed exactly how the company had quietly categorized him, and Evan responded without anger, telling the guard simply that what was failing inside that building did not need a maintenance worker. It needed the person who had actually built it. Serena came down personally to retrieve him from the lobby, and in that small, almost forgettable moment of watching a man blocked at the entrance to a celebration built entirely around his own work, she understood something about the company's culture more clearly than any audit ever could have shown her. The simple fact that Hawthorne Vector was willing to use a person's intelligence without ever allowing that same person through the door where credit was given. Once inside, several executives glanced at Evan the way they might glance at a delivery worker passing through an event clearly meant for people more important than him, and Preston, attempting to maintain control of the moment even as it slipped away from him, introduced Evan to nearby guests only as a technician helping resolve a minor issue with the display. Evan ignored him entirely, walking straight to the failing unit and discovering exactly what he expected to find: confirmation that the underlying code had been deliberately altered to erase his authorship, and he refused to restart the system quietly behind closed doors, insisting instead that the diagnostic process be shown openly to everyone still present in the room. Genevieve wanted the situation handled privately, away from cameras and curious investors, but both Lenora Sloan and Reginald Carrington insisted Evan's request was reasonable, and so, in front of hundreds of witnesses, Evan opened the full version history of the system for everyone to see, a history showing plainly that he had built the original core architecture, that Preston had never written a single line of functioning code, that Evan's name had been deliberately deleted only after the solution succeeded, that an account tied to the office of the chief operating officer had made that exact change, and that this same change was the direct cause of the failure, now threatening to embarrass the entire company in front of federal officials. A few of the investors standing closest to the screen leaned forward as the version history moved past, watching timestamps and commit logs the way they might watch a courtroom exhibit, because numbers like these did not allow for the kind of comfortable ambiguity a polished speech could usually rely on, and even Genevieve, watching from a few steps away, found herself unable to look anywhere, except directly at the evidence now playing out in front of an audience she had spent weeks reassuring. Evan restored the original, unaltered version of the system, and within moments the thermal readings stabilized completely, just as the screen behind him automatically displayed a single line that no one in that room had requested and no one could now deny, a line reading simply, designed by Evan Rourke, and every eye in that massive hall slowly turned toward Preston. Reginald ordered the ballroom doors sealed and called an emergency board session right there inside a private meeting room attached to the hotel, refusing to wait even a single day for a more convenient hour. And Preston, cornered but still unwilling to surrender, argued that Evan had merely executed an idea while the true strategy and resources behind its success belonged to leadership alone. Evan did not ask to claim total credit for himself, choosing instead to name 2 technicians who had assisted him through those 17 exhausting nights, along with several engineers who had supported the broader testing effort, an honesty that stood in stark, almost uncomfortable contrast to everything Preston had spent weeks constructing for himself. Serena laid out the full chain of evidence before the board without hesitation, beginning with Evan's provisional patent filing predating his employment, followed by internal emails in which Preston explicitly ordered authorship records erased, invoices revealing payments to an outside communications firm hired specifically to build what one document literally called the Rothwell saved Hawthorne narrative, proof that the fabricated competitor file had originated from Preston's own remote access session, confirmation that the official guest list had been deliberately edited to exclude Evan, and records showing that bonus funds originally earmarked for the technical team had instead been quietly redirected into an executive discretionary budget. One of Preston's own assistants finally admitted, voice shaking, that he had personally ordered her to remove Evan's name from the original presentation slides weeks earlier, explaining that she had stayed silent until now only because she feared losing her job the moment she said anything at all. Genevieve sat through every piece of testimony in near silence, slowly recognizing that she had not simply been deceived by Preston. She had actively chosen, again and again, to trust a polished title over verifiable evidence, choosing comfortable hierarchy instead of uncomfortable truth at every single point where she might have asked a harder question. And somewhere in that recognition she understood that her failure had never been a single decision, but a pattern, repeated so often it had simply stopped feeling like a choice at all. Preston, refusing to back down even as the room turned against him, insisted that without his leadership, Evan's solution would have remained buried inside a forgotten testing lab forever, and Evan answered him with a quiet, unhurried calm that landed far harder than any raised voice could have, telling him plainly that without his work, the company would be holding a funeral tonight instead of a celebration. Reginald called for an immediate board vote to suspend Preston from all duties effective that same hour, and as the votes were cast one after another around that table, not a single member of the board chose to stand beside him. Preston's access credentials were revoked before he even left the building, and he was handed over to internal investigators alongside outside authorities, prepared to examine the fabricated evidence and falsified records connected to the entire affair. The very trophy that had once symbolized his triumph left abandoned beneath the stage lights, as though it had simply been waiting all along for someone honest enough to claim it. Genevieve walked back out onto that same stage, facing hundreds of investors, officials, and reporters, still waiting for an explanation of everything that had unfolded that night. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she set aside the prepared remarks her communications team had written for her in favor of something closer to the truth. She told the room plainly that Evan Rourke had discovered the original flaw, that he had personally designed the system that ultimately saved the company more than $11 billion, that his name had been deliberately removed from every meaningful record of that achievement, that he had not even been invited to the celebration built around his own work, and that she herself bore responsibility for never questioning why a man without an executive title had been treated as though his contribution did not matter. Genevieve invited Evan onto the stage to formally accept the very trophy Preston had once held, but Evan did not reach for it right away, asking instead that the two technicians who had stood beside him through those long nights be called up and recognized by name in front of everyone watching. Lenora announced that the federal contract had not been canceled outright, but that it would only proceed once Hawthorne Vector corrected its entire intellectual property record and reached a fair, transparent agreement directly with the man who actually owned the underlying technology. When Genevieve asked what amount of money would be enough to finally settle the matter and transfer full commercial rights, Evan answered that money alone could never repair what had actually been broken that night, because what had been taken from him was never just a paycheck. It was the simple right to be acknowledged for work everyone in that room had quietly depended on for survival. Evan then placed in front of the board a short list of conditions with the power to reshape not just his own situation, but the way an entire company treated every engineer who would ever again create something worth celebrating long after he was gone. Evan agreed to grant Hawthorne Vector full commercial rights to his technology, but only under terms designed to outlast his own employment there, beginning with a requirement that his original authorship be permanently restored across every technical record the company maintained, followed by fair, documented compensation for the two technicians stood beside him through the hardest stretch of those 17 nights. He further required the creation of an independent engineering integrity council with the authority to investigate any future dispute over authorship or credit, a rule preventing any single executive from unilaterally editing or removing an engineer's name from internal documentation ever again, and formal protection for any employee who raised a safety concern, ensuring no one would face retaliation simply for being the first person willing to say a number on a screen actually mattered. Evan also asked that a portion of the technology's future profits be directed into a scholarship fund supporting young engineers, that he personally retain authority to halt deployment of any system failing to meet proper safety standards, and that senior leadership be required to sit through direct technical reviews with working engineers, rather than relying solely on polished summary reports, written for people who had never opened the underlying files themselves. Genevieve accepted every condition without negotiation, then offered Evan the title of Vice President of Technology, an offer he declined without hesitation, explaining that he had no interest in a title that existed mainly to be photographed rather than to be useful to the people actually doing the work. Instead, Evan chose the newly created role of Director of Systems Integrity, reporting directly to the board rather than to any single executive, while insisting on keeping a small office near the engineers he had always considered his real colleagues, the people who understood exactly what those 17 nights had cost him. Marin visited her father not long after the story became public, walking with him past a design board where his name now appeared exactly where it always should have, and Evan told her quietly that what he wanted her to remember from all of this was never the image of a powerful company finally bowing to pressure, but the simpler fact that he had refused to sign a lie even at the moment he needed money the most. Several months later, when Hawthorne Vector finally finalized its federal contract in full, Genevieve traveled down to the engineering floor herself to share the news, choosing a quiet room instead of a grand ballroom, ensuring that the names of Evan and his entire team appeared above every executive title listed on the announcement. And when a staff member later handed Evan a formal invitation to the company's next anniversary celebration, he looked at it for a long moment, set it gently beside an old worn sketch from his original notebook, and understood, finally, that he no longer needed an invitation to prove he belonged inside that building, because it was his work, quietly and completely, that had kept its lights burning in the first place. Genevieve, for her part, never claimed to have transformed overnight into a different kind of leader, telling the engineering staff plainly during that quiet announcement that real change would have to be measured over years, rather than over a single difficult night, and Evan respected that honesty more than he would have respected an easy, sweeping promise, because he had already learned, the hard way, that the people most willing to admit how far they still had to go were usually the only ones who actually managed to get there. In the end, what stayed with Evan was never the trophy, never the corrected paperwork, and never even the formal apology that eventually arrived in writing from the board itself, but the simple, quiet image of his daughter standing beside that design board, reading his own name in his own handwriting style finally printed where it belonged, a small correction in a large company that nonetheless meant more to him than any number with a dollar sign in front of it ever could.